Today you're about to explore the most successful chess opening gambit for white, the Haxo Gambit, which scores crazily high 73% win rate. It comes out of the first move pawn e4, so if you play this move, it's going to serve you really well, and after your opponent goes into the usual thing, instead of playing bishop c4 right away, you first sacrifice a pawn by playing pawn to d4. Now that threatens to either capture this pawn or to go forward and to attack this knight on c6, therefore in pretty much all the games that you play, they're going to capture this pawn. And now instead of recapturing it yourself, you don't waste time doing so, but you prioritize quick development because you want to attack, and so we play bishop to c4. Now the crazy thing about this gambit is that lots of natural moves of your opponent lose very badly. There are literally traps at every turn for your opponent to fall for, and even if they avoid all the traps, which is rare, you still end up with a solid position and there is absolutely no risk for you to try it out. Now, the main move by black, the most common move, is the move bishop c5, which seems to make a lot of sense. They're developing a bishop and they try to hold on to this extra pawn on d4. Sometimes they'll also try out knight f6, which also looks interesting. In this case, I'm going to show you how you can use the fried liver on steroids. I'm not sure if you want to taste the fried liver on steroids, but anyway. Let's start off with the main line, bishop to c5. Again, seem to make a lot of sense for black, developing a bishop, defending this pawn twice, therefore you cannot get it back, and so you kind of pretend like you gave up on trying to get your material back, and you just play pawn to c3 trying to develop your knight after an exchange. Therefore your opponent thinks, okay, I'm gonna take it, because if not, it feels annoying if you take on d4 yourself and attack this bishop. Your opponent can possibly go forward in the future, attack the knight. It all looks annoying, therefore in most games they do capture here on c3. And here comes the first surprise. It turns out that the move pawn takes c3, such a natural move, is actually a big mistake, which leads to a losing position for black, because instead of recapturing, you all of a sudden sack your bishop over here on f7. And you gotta really memorize this tactical motif because it works across multiple different variations of this gambit. Now black will need to recapture, and here it turns out that you can follow up with queen to d5, which is a double attack to the king and the bishop. Therefore you get back your bishop right on the next move, but now the king is completely exposed, and therefore you have this free attack against the overexposed king. In most cases here, your opponents will play a natural move king to e8. It does look bad for black to go king to f8, allowing you to capture this bishop with a check to their king, and so they don't play there, even though it's the best option. I mean, that's the funny thing about this variation. As I mentioned earlier, like, all the natural moves of black are actually wrong, so they have to come up with really advanced counterintuitive moves, which, almost nobody will be capable of doing. So they go king to e8, trying to avoid being checked, but here the king stays in the middle of the board, allowing you to attack it later on. And you could take the bishop right away, but a little bit of a pro tip here is to give this in-between check queen to h5. What's the point? Well, you induce this move pawn to g6, which will only support your attack down the road. And in most cases, they do play this move pawn to g6. Now you come back and take this bishop on c5. And that's like the most played moves of this variation, and it gives you this crazy high win rate, because think about this. Let's not forget that black's king has moved back and forth, and therefore it can no longer castle. It's gonna stay in the middle of the board forever, waiting for you to checkmate it. And you didn't even need to sacrifice anything to get to this position. Now what can black do? If they take here on b2, you gotta thank your opponent, because now you'll have this monstrous bishop really helping your attack. Notice how useful it is for us to have this pawn on g6, not on g7 where it would cover the rook. So that's why we put in this in between check with queen on h5. We wanted this pawn to be on g6. Now you can see why. If they don't take your pawn on b2, that doesn't really change anything, because overall black's main problem is the centralized king that can no longer castle. So if they play any other moves, alright, you can now take this pawn with a queen and keep an eye on this rook on h8. Say they cover it, you can just castle, and your moves are really, really simple. I mean, you just develop, you can play a bishop g5, pinning this knight, your queen is putting pressure here. At some point, you're gonna play a rook e1, e5, and just checkmate this king along the e-file. I mean, I'll just show you real quick one game how it ended. You don't have to memorize these moves. It's just going to show how quickly black can go down, and their position is lost anyway, regardless of what they do. In this game, they tried rook f8, trying to remove this rook from this potential x-ray. White played bishop h6, attacking the rook. Black said, okay, I'm going to go here. White played knight g5, this time attacking the rook once again. Now, black realized that they can't cover their king, because that would hand this knight on f6. The queen from d8 is no longer defended. So instead they play rook to d7, a little bit awkward, but what can they do? And here I play rook e1, like as we discussed, one of the main ideas of white is just to open up the e-file and get to the king. And black thought, okay, how do I untangle somehow my pieces? He tried knight g4 attacking this bishop, but this failed to queen h8 check, and it's actually a checkmate within a couple moves. So queen g7, queen to f8, checkmate. It's a very typical game in the Haxo Gambit. Black played all the natural moves, but collapsed really badly. Going back to the main position of the Haxo Gambit, we have covered the move pawn takes c3, and we know that it is actually a natural mistake of black. After that, you can pull off these tactics with bishop takes f7, followed by queen to d5, and you rock and roll here. You're gonna checkmate black pretty soon. What else can black try here? If they don't take on c3, they may try to develop and to castle quickly with knight to f6, and it's actually a good move to play. What are you gonna do in this case? I recommend you to castle. It's a useful move, and it's also an awaiting move. We actually give black one more chance to go wrong and to fall into the same trap, and in most cases they do, which is nice. Now, why don't you want to take here? Well, the point is, after taking on d4, of course, temporarily it looks super nice. You attack the bishop, your pawns are ready to go forward and attack, but what saves the day for black is that they have this check, which is check to your king, and after that they can do something about your center. So pawn takes d4 does not win the game. It in fact transposed to the main line of the Italian game, and if you're not familiar with it, you can stay away from that and just castle. Again, it's a useful move, but it's also an awaiting move. Now, what can black do here? Now pawn takes d4 is a real threat. Bishop b4 will not count with check any longer, and so pawn takes d4 will be unpleasant. You'll attack the bishop, your pawn can go forward, attack this knight away. Taking on e4 also looks kind of dangerous for black, because you can take there, keep marching forward, attack him along the e-file. So it all looks dangerous, and in most cases they'll end up taking here on c3. Once again, it's the most natural move for black to play. And now you can play pawn to e5 first. We want to chase away this knight from f6. In most cases they will. Move it somewhere, and after that, guess what? They fall into the same main trap of the Haxo Gambit. Bishop takes f7. And after king takes, you could follow up with the move queen to d5. That would lead to the variation similar to the main line of Haxo Gambit, which we talked about previously, and you have all the same advantages. So basically, you get back your bishop on the next move, and black is ended up with this exposed centralized king that you attack, and life's good. Basically, it's a winning position for white. But instead, what I like doing is to try another little trick. It's knight to g5 check to the king. Notice that our knight is defended by the bishop, therefore it cannot be captured by their queen, meaning that they have to move the king. And like the most played move by black here is king to g8. Instinctively, they want to hide the king somewhere in the corner to safety, and this g8 square seems like nearly a castle-in position, with the exception of the rook not being on f8. And they expect you to take this knight on g4, which would be a nice option for white, but besides that, you've got a much stronger thing to play. It's queen to d5 still, and the point is, this time, not even to get back the bishop on the next move, which you could do, but you can just checkmate black. So that's also funny, and once again, let me reinforce this fact that in many variations and sub-variations of this Haxo Gambit, natural moves of black lead them to disaster. Right after you played bishop to c4, there is one more thing that your opponent may try out. Instead of playing bishop to c5 trying to hold on to this pawn, some of your opponents will prefer to play safe. They don't know an opening theory, and they just want to avoid being attacked quickly. And therefore they play pawn to h6, so that you can't go knight to g5 and attack the square f7, similar to the fried liver attack. So with this move pawn to h6, they hope to play it safe and just develop normally. But, of course, life is not going to be easy for black here. We're going to castle. We're following the same strategy. We're playing a useful move, and it's also an awaiting move. We give black an opportunity to go wrong once again and to fall into our main trap, which they will. In most games, they will play bishop c5, ending up to the position very similar to what we have covered so far. Now, going knight f6 instead does not look very good for black, because then you can always push e5, and this knight has to go somewhere, and, sometimes they move right there, which is quite funny. So they relocate it from g8 to h7, another equally bad square. And for that reason, they quite often end up playing bishop c5 anyway. And now, you know what to do by now, right? We sack the pawn right here with pawn to c3. Pawn takes d4 is a real threat. They have to take over here. And now we pull off our main trick. Bishop takes f7, followed by queen to d5 check. As the king goes back, you can now capture the bishop. In this position, queen h5 makes less sense because you don't really provoke pawn g6 anyway. In this position, g6 makes no sense for black because, the pawn is kind of really weak there. So queen h5 in this case is not necessary. You can just go ahead and take the bishop straight away. And that leads to the position, again, very similar to all these main lines of Haxo. You don't really need to know any theory here or to memorize, just need to know these main tactics, all right? And after that, you just develop, and then you attack the centralized king. That's it. For example, let's say they take on b2, you thank them, and you recapture, which reinforces your attack. Now, currently this pawn on g7 is hanging, they gotta cover it, let's say knight f6, then you can push forward with e5, pressing this knight on f6, and what can they do? You then just develop, play rooks in the center of the board, attack the centralized king. Again, it can no longer castle because it has moved back and forth, and according to the rules of chess, it can't castle anymore, and black's in big trouble. It's a winning position for white. As you aim for the Haxo Gambit and you anticipate your opponent to go bishop c5, in most cases they will, but some of your opponents will choose to play knight to f6 in this position. What do you do then? Well, you could play pawn to e5 or you could castle kingside, and these are all nice moves, but they lead to more complicated theoretical variations. And I wanted to keep things simple for you so that you can just learn this one video lesson which you're watching right now and you're all ready to rock and roll. That's why instead of all that, I recommend our unhealthy food, fried liver on steroids. You go knight g5. And it's very similar to the classical fried liver attack when your minor pieces team up against these pawn on f7. The difference is you also included that move pawn to d4 in advance. And it's actually quite nice for you because you have more open lines for your pieces possibly to go forward and to attack black. Now after knight g5, in most cases your pawn will see that this pawn is hanging and they'll cover it by going pawn to d5. Now you take it and they recapture naturally. Guess what? This move is a losing error. Crazy. I mean, it's really nearly impossible for anybody to somehow foresee that knight takes d5, such a natural move, is bad for black, but it is a losing error. That's why this Haxo Gambit is so crazily effective overall, because it's really requires a super well-prepared opponent to somehow survive against you. Now, the main reason why knight takes d5 is bad is that it kind of creates a lot of these weaknesses, and you can create a lot of pressure against all of them, and black collapses. Now, you cannot take on f7 right away. I mean, you could, but it's not as effective as in the classical fried liver, because if he takes with the king, well, that's cool. We can continue with queen to f3 with a double attack to the king and this knight on d5. We take back the knight on the next move. We keep attacking. Life's good. But the problem is, if your opponent is like an advanced level guy, instead of taking here, he may play this queen e7 check, and it's somewhat unpleasant because there is no convenient way for you to cover your king. That's why instead of playing knight takes f7 immediately, we just castle first. And we reserve this opportunity to play knight takes f7 on the next move. And there is not much black can do really about that, because you're threatening knight takes f7, maybe rook e1, check to the king. Queen f3 is also a strong move, which can add a lot of pressure to black's position on the next move. And just by the sheer amount of arrows that are drawn here, you can see that black's in trouble. Usually, they'll try bishop e7, desperately trying to castle on the next move, but you don't give them this luxury, you just take on f7 right away. They recapture. And here you could continue with the usual way of the fried liver attack, queen to f3 check. It's a perfectly fine move. And on the next move, you're going to get back this knight on d5, continue attacking, and black's position is tough. But what I prefer playing here instead of queen f3 is a little bit more evil move. It's move queen h5, which kind of saves the same purpose. You attack the king as well as you put pressure to this knight on d5 so that you're ready to recapture it with your bishop on the next move. But another nice thing is that in most cases, again, they play natural moves pawn to g6. You take over here, delivering check to the king. They want to hide it, so they play king to g7. It temporarily looks really good for black. Looks like they nearly put their king to safety, and it's all good besides the fact that it is checkmate in two moves. After bishop h6 check and after king to f6 is queen to g5. Again, crazy stuff going on here. I don't know what's wrong with this gambit because black has traps to fall for on every turn. All their natural moves are losing. They have to play counterintuitive moves to survive. You may be wondering, it can't be all that bad for black, there must be a way out. Well, of course, with perfect play, any game should end in a draw, but it rarely happens because both players play multiple errors throughout the game. Now, instead of going bishop c5 here, it's better for black to play this move knight f6, although a lot of players will refrain from doing so because it feels that e5 is unpleasant here. Now, as you go knight g5, aiming for this some sort of the right liver attack, instead of going for this d5 and knight takes d5 thing, they gotta play knight e5. That's the difference compared to the main line of the fried liver, because in the main line, this pawn is not on d4 but on e5, and so black cannot physically move their knight there because there's pawn standing there, but in this position this square is vacant and they may play knight e5, which hits their bishop as well as defends this pawn on f7. Now, the downside of knight e5 is that this pawn on d4 is no longer defended by the knight, therefore you can capture it. Putting pressure here. They trade off your bishop, and you end up just with an equal position. By the way, there is a chance for them to blunder checkmate right on the next move, because you still attack the square on f7, but objectively it is an equal position, which is another great upside of this whole gambit, because even if your opponent plays right moves, you just end up with a normal equal position. Also, I know that you may be wondering, like, okay, Igor, it's all cool, I'm excited, but I'm wondering what if I forget all these variations in 2 minutes? Well, you don't have to memorize it all, it's just enough to know it a little bit better than your opponent to win the game. And the majority of your opponents know nothing about it, nothing at all. So knowing something more than nothing is a pretty simple task, right? And finally, if you also want to learn how to master the art of attack so that you know how to find the right attacking moves on your own, I've got a free masterclass that you can check out right there, and it's going to help you in all the games that you play. Keep crushing it, and I'll talk to you soon.